Okay, as you know, this year we're focusing on Buddhism through time and space. And for the last few weeks, we've been looking at the Buddhist traditions of China and Japan. And tonight we're going to focus on one of the great masters of Rinzai Zen, Hakuin Ekaku. So Rinzai is one of the Zen Buddhism schools. So a bit about Hakuin to begin with. So I'm going to say a bit about Hakuin. I'm going to tell you a bit about koans. I'm going to talk about how that is relevant to us here and now in Suryamati, the Sheffield Buddhist Centre, and give you some examples of koans. And yeah, that's about it really. I'm going to start off with telling you a bit about Hakuin, because he's a very fascinating character, amazing character. So he was born in Japan in 1686, and he lived to be over 80, and he became a towering figure in Zen Buddhism, but he was also quite a famous poet, he was an artist, and he was a calligrapher, so he was a multi-talented man. And pictures of him generally show, generally show him with a kyosaku. Not quite sure whether that's how you pronounce it, but anyway, it's a wake-up stick, that stick in his hand. I think that says something about his approach to practice and his approach to teaching Buddhism. He's determined and he's uncompromising. And he's mainly remembered these days for reinvigorating the Rinzai Zen school of Buddhism, and kind of reviving its traditional, very rigorous training in meditation and koans. And his influence is such that actually today all Rinzai Zen masters trace their lineage back through him, and most modern Rinzai Zen practitioners use his teachings and his practices. So really, really influential man. And although he was obviously a very advanced practitioner and in some ways a very fierce teacher, his writings and his biography show him, I think, as quite a human person. He, in the early parts of his life, he suffered various bouts of depression and anxiety. He had a health breakdown from practicing too hard at one point. He made mistakes. At times, he found the Buddhist path very hard and was subject to great doubts. So much so that at one point he just gave it up completely and went off and did something else for 5 years. So, a bit about his life. He entered a monastery when he was just 14. And partly he was propelled into the monastery by fear of the hell realms and the belief that Buddhist practice would protect him from the sufferings of hell. And that does seem to be a naively literal belief on his part, because 4 or 5 years later, reading after he'd entered the monastery, he was reading the biography of the 9th century Zen master, Ganto, and he was horrified to learn that Ganto had been brutally murdered. And Hakuin concluded from that, in despair really, that the Dharma could not, after all, protect Buddhist practitioners from all sufferings. And that triggered a real crisis of doubt. It was a real spiritual crisis for him. And in spite of having had his first ordination by that time, he just gave up his practice and he left the monastery and he went off to do something completely different. He went to study literature and calligraphy. But of course, literature and calligraphy weren't going to assuage his anxieties. And 5 years later, he had another crisis, another sort of breakdown really. And that episode ended when he saw an old pile of books that had been abandoned in the corner of a balcony where he used to sit and read. And it was a pivotal moment for him. In his autobiography, he describes the sight of this pile of books as filling him with great joy. He just saw this pile of books and he thought, there's something really important for me there. And he made a prayer to the Buddhas to show him the way to escape from suffering if there was such a thing, such a way. And he closed his eyes and he pulled out a book at random and he opened that book at random, and what he read changed his life. So the book he chose was, it was called and again apologies if anyone speaks Japanese, the Zekan Sakushin, which means spurring students to break through the Zen barrier. And he opened it, not at a profound Dharma teaching, but at a description of the practice of the Zen master Jimyo. So I'm going to read you the passage that changed Hakuin's life. The freezing weather had frightened away all other practitioners, but Jimyo's aspiration was set firmly on the practice of the way. He did Zazen continuously. As he sat through the long nights, whenever he felt sleepy, he would jab himself in the thigh with a gimlet. Afterwards, he succeeded Funyo, who presumably was one of the other Zen masters. His vigorous spirit enlivened the Zen world of his time. He became known as the lion west of the river. Okay? That was what he read. And what Hakuin realised was that what was missing from his own practice was a sort of firm resolve that Master Jimyo had had. And he took up his practice again with a lot more determination. And actually from that point on, although he had doubts and he changed his mind about where he should be and what he should do, he did actually stick with his practice, and he did actually practice with great determination. So he applied himself very firmly, very consistently, very determinedly. But it wasn't a smooth path for him. He was still troubled by doubts. And he practiced very hard, and he did have some really big meditation experiences. But it seemed that whenever he had a meditation breakthrough, he kind of assumed that this was it, this was the big one, that he was enlightened. And he was repeatedly knocked back by his teachers as an arrogant fool. And in his tradition, in Rinzai Zen, because the main practices were meditating and reflecting on koans, and then discussing how your progress with your teacher, and because Zen masters, Rinzai Zen masters, thought the tough approach was the best one to take with unenlightened practitioners, he had quite a hard time actually. So I'm going to read you some extracts from Hakuin's accounts of his times with Soju Rojin, whom he came to regard as his main teacher. Hakuin had been given a number of koans to contemplate by Soju Rojin, and most notably, the one about whether a dog has Buddha nature. Okay? And I'm not going to discuss that, but the koan was about whether a dog has Buddha nature. And he practiced the koan very, very hard. And actually, he got to the point where he thought he'd had a major breakthrough. He thought he'd seen into the nature of reality. And he was feeling pretty pleased with himself. So here's what he says. I related my understanding to the master one day during Sanzen. He said to me, commitment to the study of Zen has to be a true commitment. What about the dog and Buddha nature? So this was the moment that Hakuin had been waiting for. He was going to demonstrate to his teacher his insight. So Hakuin says, there's no way at all for a hand or foot to touch it. He suddenly reached out, this is the Zen master, grabbed my nose in his hand and gave it a sharp push. How's that for touch, he declared. I was incapable of moving forward. I couldn't retreat. I couldn't spit a single syllable out. After that, I was totally disheartened and frustrated. I sat red-eyed and miserable. My cheeks burned from constant tears. I resumed my practice. I didn't stop for sleep. The master came and shouted abuse at me. I was doing Zen down a hole, he said. And then after a number of such episodes, Hakuin began to have doubts about whether he'd actually got the right teacher. So, okay, well you can kind of see why, can't you? I reasoned, there are great monasteries all over the place. Celebrated masters reside in them. They're numerous as sesame or flax. That old man in his wretched, ramshackle old poorhouse of a temple, and that preposterous pride of his. I'd be better off leaving here for a better temple. Still deeply dejected, I took up my begging bowl early in the morning and went into the village below Leyama Castle. My mind was hard at work on my koans. It never left them. I stood before the gate of a house, my bowl in hand, lost in a kind of trance. A voice within yelled, "Go on, go somewhere else!" But I was so preoccupied I didn't even notice it. This must have angered the resident of the house, because suddenly she appeared, flourishing a broom upside down in her hand. She flew at me, flailing out wildly, whacking away at my head, as if she was bent on dashing my brains out. My sedge hat lay in tatters. I was knocked down and ended up head over heels on the ground. I lost consciousness and lay there like a dead man. As I regained consciousness, my eyes opened, and as they did, I found that the unsolvable and impenetrable koans I'd been working on, all those pointed cat's paws, were completely penetrated, right to the root. They'd suddenly ceased to exist. I clapped my hands and laughed great shouts of laughter, frightening the people who had gathered around me. "He's lost his mind. Crazy monk," they shouted, and shrank back from me. They turned and ran off without looking back. So that was Hakuin's second realization. But one of the things that Hakuin's teachers taught him, and that he in turn passed on to his disciples, was that there are very many levels of insight. And it's a great mistake to settle down and think you've made it when you've had a big meditation experience or realization. So over the many decades of his life, he lived to be 80, he himself had many realizations. He practiced under other teachers. He lived in many monasteries. He became the abbot of several monasteries. And his approach to practice was one of self-discipline and strenuous practice. He was a great critic of what he called the do-nothing Zenists. Buddhists who, upon reaching some small experience of insight, devote the rest of their lives to passing day after day in a state of seated sleep. Again, he's kind of warning against thinking you've had an insight experience and then just settling down to enjoy blissful states of meditation. Hakuin's practice, and that of his pupils, was very rigorous. It involved physical work, it involved lots of meditation, and running through it all, constant koan practice. And Hakuin demanded three things from himself and the monks that he trained. The three things, they're quite pithy, so I wrote them down. Great faith, great doubt, and great tenacity. Okay, so that might sound a bit contradictory. It's a bit of a koan, really, isn't it? Great faith means, well, he was talking about having great faith in the Dharma, having great faith in the teachings. And he did expect his students to know the Dharma. He did expect his students to be familiar with sutras, to know the Dharma from several different traditions, and to be constantly reflecting on it and thinking about it, and to have great faith in its efficacy. So that's a great faith. The great tenacity is kind of fairly obvious. He was insistent that his pupils, people he was teaching, like him, should just be determined and should carry on whatever. Should carry on in the face of abuse, should carry on in the face of doubt, should carry on in the face of difficulties. Just keep going. But the great doubt has a very particular meaning. Great doubt means Great doubt refers here to koan practice. And he said, with koan practice, great doubt is what you're aiming for. Great doubt is not the sort of doubt that had tempted him to give up his Buddhist practice at one point. Great doubt is the unsettling ball of doubt that comes from energetic koan practice. So I'm going to talk about koans in a minute, but before I do, I thought I might just show you some pictures of Hakuin that kind of tell you a little bit about his character. So this one is, this is a self-portrait of Hakuin, by Hakuin, of him with his wake-up stick. This is a portrait done by someone else, and I've got no idea whether it was done from life, but it's not unlike the self-portraits that we have of him. And well, actually, yeah, there's quite a lot of character in that carving. It's a wooden rupa. That's the face. So imagine having him standing up here in front of you, doing a talk, with his wake-up stick. This is another self-portrait, slightly softer actually, so he wasn't fierce all the time, I think. And this one is another self-portrait of himself in meditation. But the most famous one, and the one that somehow has become iconic of Hakuin, is him with his wake-up stick, and this is just a blown-up version of the one that we saw at the beginning. So I'll leave that one up for you to look at. Okay, so what about koans? What exactly is a koan? So a koan is a traditional phrase that is paradoxical in nature and that points to the nature of ultimate reality. Okay? Traditional phrase, paradoxical in nature, pointing to the nature of ultimate reality. And for koan practice, you need a master to set koans that are appropriate to your level of practice. And you're expected to reflect on that koan, to meditate on that koan, to keep turning it over and over in your mind, whatever you're doing. Whether you're going about whether you're going begging for food, or you're eating your food, or you're sweeping the yard, or whatever you're doing, you're keeping your koan turning over and over in your mind. It is said that you concentrate making your whole body one great inquiry. Day and night, you work intently at it. You do not attempt nihilistic or dualistic interpretations. Arousing this great inquiry, or great doubt, this is the great doubt, is an essential element of koan practice. It builds up a strong internal pressure, never stopping. Knocking from within at the door of the mind, demanding to be resolved. And to illustrate the enormous concentration that was required for koan practice, one of the Zen masters, Wunen, commented that reflecting on a koan is like swallowing a red-hot iron ball. It gets stuck in your gullet. You try to vomit it up, but you can't. You can't swallow it down, you can't digest it, it's just stuck there. So a koan is like a red-hot iron ball, stuck in your digestive tract. You're continually and uncomfortably aware of it. You're propelled urgently to try and resolve the koan, to get rid of it, to get rid of the burning sensation. And there are other analogies for koan practice. One is that it's like being stuck at the edge of a precipice, looking at an enormous drop. Or that it's like being at the top of a greasy pole. In both cases, going back isn't an option. Going back means accepting samsara and its suffering. Even worse, if you're a Zen practitioner, going back means facing the wake-up stick and the tongue lashing of the Zen master. There's no option but to jump into the unknown. So the purpose of a koan is to bring the mind to a state of the highest possible tension, so as to leave it only two possibilities: either to live with the unbearable tension, or to go beyond the mind's usual limits, to break through, to seeing things the way they really are. Okay, that's the theory. I can give you some examples of koans, but I'm not going to go in too much to how you would reflect on them. But some of the most famous koans, so these four. There's the dog and Buddha nature koan, and the koan that you're asked to reflect upon is: does a dog have Buddha nature or not? Okay, might seem simple to begin with, but apparently if you really go into it, it gets very complex. And there's the original face koan. Without thinking of good or evil, show me your original face before your mother or father were born. Okay, that one's a bit more perplexing, isn't it? And then there's the killing the Buddha koan. So the koan is: if you meet the Buddha, kill him. Okay, that's challenging. And then there's Hakuin's own koan. He invented several koans, but the most well-known of Hakuin's koan is the sound of one hand. So the koan is: two hands clap, and there is a sound. What is the sound of one hand? Okay, that's it. You're probably not going to get it now. You need to reflect on it for years, and it needs to really get to you like a burning ball stuck in your gullet before it'll really have an effect. So you could take away one of those, but actually in a way I think I want to look at, well, how are koans relevant to us? So the first thing I should say is that the centre team had a meeting recently, and we've decided that we should change our approach to teaching at the centre. We're going to introduce a bit of nose grabbing, a bit of haranguing, and we're going to have someone with a wake-up stick touring meditations and hitting people at random. Okay? So, okay, maybe we won't do that. But there are other ways in which koans and Hakuin's approach are relevant to us. The way that they're relevant is that I think that whether we recognise it or not, and probably most of us haven't even thought about it, most of us live with koans. Koans are a really important part of our practice, in fact. In a way, learning about the Dharma is a koan. Listening to a Dharma talk like this is a koan. We're using words, I'm using words, you're listening to them. We're using words and concepts to try to move us towards something that is completely beyond words and concepts. Okay, that's a bit of a koan. You could reflect on that for quite a long time, actually. Try and get your mind around it. Then, enlightenment as wisdom and compassion is a koan. We're constantly talking about wisdom and compassion, two aspects of enlightenment. Wisdom and compassion, to me, seem really different. And yet, they come together in enlightenment. How is that? And then, there are loads and loads of koans within the Dharma. And actually, I've made a list of one or two, which I'll mention in a minute. But in a way, the point is to spot koans for yourself. To spot the things that actually seem a bit odd to you, or seem paradoxical to you, or that you don't really get. Because actually it may be that you don't really get them because they are paradoxical, because they don't make sense. So we often talk here about self-power and other power. Well, self-power and other power are paradoxical, aren't they? They're two very, very different models for, spiritual practice. You could meditate on that. That's quite a koan. In fact, self and other is probably a koan. Enlightenment as beyond time is a koan. If enlightenment is beyond time, how can we ever get to it? Or perhaps, on the other hand, it's eternally present. If it's eternally present, then it's a possibility in every moment. There's quite a lot that you could reflect on there. So I think that actually in the course of learning about the Dharma, you'll come across loads and loads of koans. And in a way, you just need to notice them. And I think that you just need to notice the things that don't sit comfortably with you and go away and reflect on them. Make them a koan. Just see if you can, I don't know, move them around in your mind. Look at them from different perspectives. But I'm not going to talk about any of those koans tonight, because most of us in Triratna share a common koan, and it's as real a koan as the sound of one hand clapping. And I think that we need to bring it into focus and treat it with the reverence and energy that Hakuin applied to his koans. It's a koan that we live, and that does, in my experience, create quite a lot of tension. It's a koan that requires constant decisions, and is therefore, with me a lot of the time, like Hakuin's koans. And actually, I haven't come across anyone yet calling it a koan, but I hear it discussed constantly by my colleagues who work on the centre team, by order members and mitras, and relatively new Sangha members. Sangharachita talks about it as a creative conflict, out of which the bodhicitta can arise. So quite a serious koan this. What Sangharachita says is, there is a conflict if you're big enough and rich enough in your nature to embrace the possibilities of such a conflict. The bodhicitta, so this is the determination to achieve enlightenment for your own sake and for the sake of others. The bodhicitta is said to arise as a result of the coalescence of two trends of experience, which are generally considered to be contradictory, since in ordinary experience they cannot both be pursued simultaneously. We might call these the trend of withdrawal from the world and the trend of involvement in the world. So, withdrawal from the world, involvement in the world. It sounds pretty much like a koan to me. I'm pretty sure Hakuin would have thought so. In fact, Hakuin definitely did think so, because he talks quite a lot about this koan, and he urges his monks to do both as fully as they possibly can. So when Sangharachita talks about this, he's talking about a traditional practice designed to lead to the arising of the bodhicitta, and it's therefore in many ways a very advanced practice. But because it's a tension with many of us, I think, in many of our experiences, I think it's a koan that we can very consciously live out. So I'm going to talk about my own experience of living with that koan and the tension that it creates. And you can think about how this accords with your own experience, whether you experience a similar tension or not. So my koan. Times when I experience this koan most acutely in my life. There are probably two times when I experience it most acutely. The first is when I've got a particularly difficult situation to confront, or a week crowded with meetings from end to end, or a to-do list as long as my arm. And the other time that I experience it really acutely is I'm just back from retreat, and I'm about to plunge back into my everyday life. I'm about to open my computer and see the hundreds of emails, get out my to-do list and get started. And what I feel at both of those times is just a complete longing for the solitude and simplicity of a life devoted to meditation and study. I just long for it. My calmest and my quietest, my wisest, my most inspiring moments are usually experienced on retreats. On retreat, I've got time and conditions to really get concentrated, to delve deeply into some aspect of the Dharma, to reflect and to mull over things, to really get in touch with the archetypal figures that inspire me. And even strangely, since I'm on my own a lot of the time on retreat, to feel connected with my friends and with the Sangha here. On retreat, I'm at my best. On retreat, I'm closest to, I'm most in touch with my higher spiritual aspirations. If only I could live like that all the time. And actually, I work at the Buddhist Centre, so my work is very meaningful. My surroundings are pleasant, my colleagues are, well, I couldn't ask for more lovely colleagues. They're helpful, cooperative, supportive people. My everyday experience is altogether more pleasant than, well, many other people's and probably many of yours. And yet there are still challenges. There are challenging problems to be pondered and resolved. There are boring and difficult tasks to be done. And given that we're a very successful and busy Buddhist centre, there's just an awful lot of stuff to be done. And then there's my own samskaras to be dealt with, which I hardly experience on retreat. The worldly winds of praise and blame, anxiety about not being good enough, anxiety about letting people down, aversion when things get chaotic, impatient when things happen too slowly. So stepping back into all of that after a solitary retreat can just be incredibly painful. And when I'm in the thick of activity, then I just crave that simple Dharma life, the life of withdrawal. But if I decided that, that withdrawal was the life that I was going to lead, if I decided to go into retirement and meditate and study the Dharma and not do much else, and I could do that because these days I'm not supported by the centre, I live on a pension, then actually I don't think it would benefit the world, and I don't even think it would benefit me very much. Because the thing is, I don't think it would be good for anyone for me to just please myself. If I retired from the Buddhist Centre, if Vidanya did, and Satyajoti and Bodhi Naga and Maitradasa and people who kind of keep things running at the centre, if all the other order members who run things at the centre decided that they were just going to go for the life of withdrawal, then, okay, no newcomers courses, no Sangha Night, no Mitra study, no programme, no Sangha retreats, probably no Sheffield Buddhist Centre, and my view would be here. And actually, we want to help others in the most effective way we can. We want to help people practice for their own well-being, and because it's important for us, we want to be friends with people, we want to be involved with people. And I think that, that means I've been talking about my own particular tension, my own particular situation, but I think it's the same for loads of you, probably for all of you. You want to withdraw from the world. You want to withdraw into your own inner world and develop it, make it richer. You want to have space and peace for your meditation practice. You want to read Dharma books or listen to Dharma talks. You want to prepare your Mitra study. You want to reflect on what you've learned. But at the same time, you want to be involved in life, to really care for your family and friends, to do your work, whatever it is, to act out your ethical ideals in the world. And for most of us, the life of withdrawal just isn't an option. And I suspect that probably isn't such a bad thing. Because the tension between wanting to withdraw and wanting to be involved is the koans coal face. It's where we're working hardest. For most of us, it would be a total mistake to choose between one way of life and another, even if that was an option, which for most of us it isn't. And Sangha tells us that we need to develop both tendencies. We need to develop both the life of withdrawal and the life of engagement or involvement, in spite of the tensions that inevitably follow. And he equates the withdrawal tendency with wisdom and the involvement tendency with compassion. And I'm going to read you a fairly lengthy quote in which Sangha talks about where that tension ultimately leads, because I think it's quite important and I find it quite inspiring. So he says, as we develop and pursue both of these, the withdrawal and involvement, the tension, and the tension is psychological, not psychological but spiritual, builds up and up until we simply can't go any further. So it's a bit like the koan, the description of the koan. And at that point something happens. It's very difficult to describe exactly what happens. but we can think of it provisionally as an explosion. The tension which has been generated through following these two contradictory trends simultaneously results in a breakthrough into a higher dimension of spiritual consciousness. Withdrawal and involvement are no longer two separate trends, not because they've been artificially amalgamated into one, but because the plane or level on which their duality exists, or in which it was possible for them to be two things, has been transcended. When that explosion occurs, one has the experience of being simultaneously withdrawn and involved, simultaneously out of the world and in the world. Wisdom and compassion become non-dual, not separate, not two, without at the same time being numerically one. When that breakthrough occurs, when for the first time one is both withdrawn and involved, when wisdom and compassion are not two things side by side but one thing, then the bodhicitta has arisen. Okay, so this koan, this tension that we all live with, has exactly the same effect as Hakuin's koans. And as with a koan, our practice is to recognise it, to reflect on it, and to live it out as fully as we possibly can. Not to opt only for withdrawal or only involvement, but to go full pelt for both, and to work with whatever that throws up. And Hakuin advocates exactly the same tension for his monks, telling them that they must not choose either one or another, I'm quoting now, they must not choose either one or another of the two conditions of life, the life of activity and the life of calm, because he says they're both incredibly important. Okay, so how do we work with the withdrawal and involvement koan? So I've got a few pointers, and then I'll just finish off with a little bit more about koan, about Hakuin. So, okay, I've got three things to say about working with withdrawal and involvement. The first thing is that we need to live both as fully as we possibly can. We need to make sure that we're giving them both lots of time and lots of attention. So we need to ask, is there really, genuinely, truthfully, a withdrawal aspect to my life? Am I getting enough meditation practice? Do I have a place to meditate that really encourages calm, that's quiet, that's aesthetically pleasing, and that helps me settle down to meditation? Am I getting away on retreats to give myself a longer taste of withdrawal? Am I creating time to read and reflect on the Dharma? And at the same time, am I connecting as skillfully as I can with other people? Am I acting as much as I can for the benefit of all beings, myself and others? Am I working to resolve my ethical issues? Am I developing real warm friendships? Am I trying to help and support significant people in my life? Okay, so that's the first thing. Live them both as fully as you can. Second thing is to make the koan conscious, really, and to keep it in mind as much as you can, to stay connected with it. Keep it as a thread that kind of runs through your life, even when you're really busy. And that's easy to say, but hard to do, I know. And there are a few things that might help with that. One is just to bring the koan more into awareness. So to discuss it with your spiritual friends, and actually there'll be an initial opportunity to do that in the discussion groups tonight. You can talk about withdrawal and involvement in your own life. One of the things that I find really helps is chanting mantras. It doesn't work for everyone, but it works for me really well. I chant the Maitri mantra a lot and the Avalokiteshvara mantra a lot to remind me of why I've chosen the life of involvement, why it is that I'm giving myself a really busy and sometimes challenging time. I'm doing it because I just want to bring more kindness into the world. I want to bring more compassion into the world. And the third thing that can help, and do help for me, are the archetypal figures. especially if you've got an archetypal figure that can connect you with wisdom and compassion. I especially like the archetypal figures that connect me with both wisdom and compassion together. I especially like Avalokiteshvara for that reason, because he's the Bodhisattva of compassion, but he's also the Bodhisattva who talks us through the perfection of wisdom in the Heart Sutra. So he has really, really strongly both the wisdom and compassion element to him. And then there are a couple of Adi Buddhas, they're called, archetypal figures, Vajradhara and Vajrasattva, both of whom carry in one hand the bell of wisdom, the bell of blissful wisdom, and in the other hand, the Vajra of compassionate activity, skillful means, continuous activity on behalf of the other beings. And if you really want to go for it, you could try some reminders like mindfulness bells, or something that you see regularly, something that you tie around your wrist or your finger or something, just to remind you about the koan. Remind you, oh yeah, I'm thinking about the life of withdrawal and the life of involvement. Okay, and the third thing you need is to welcome the tension. Because actually, if you do live fully both the life of withdrawal and the life of involvement, then there will be tensions. So you're going to have challenges that come from real involvement from life, from ethical dilemmas, from difficult tasks, from difficult people. And rather than resenting those difficult people and difficult tasks, well, you can welcome them as part of the koan that you're living with, that's going to help you break through to enlightenment. Okay, so just a little bit about the end of Hakuin's life. Because, after many insight experiences, Hakuin describes his very final insight as the need to arouse the bodhicitta, the determination to gain enlightenment for the sake of all beings. He writes, what is to be valued above all else is the practice that comes after satori is achieved. What is that practice? It is the practice that puts the bodhicitta first and foremost. In my 41st year, I at long last penetrated into the heart of this great matter. Suddenly, unexpectedly, I saw it. It was as clear as if it was there in the hollow of my hand. What is the bodhicitta? It is, I realised, a matter of doing good, benefiting others by giving them the gift of the Dharma as teaching. And that in turn gave him an alternative interpretation of his own koan, the one-hand koan. And he writes that canon, so in Japan, Avalokiteshvara is known as canon. And probably, just a little bit of background to this quote, probably most of you know that Avalokiteshvara's name is based on hearing the cries of suffering beings. The name Avalokiteshvara is sometimes translated as regarder of the cries of the world. So, what Hakuin wrote was canon means to observe a sound. It is the sound of one hand. If you understand this point, you will be awakened. When your eyes can see, the whole world is canon. Avalokiteshvara. So it is the sound of one hand. If you understand this point, you will be awakened. When your eyes can see, the whole world is canon. So, koan practice brings us ultimately not just to wisdom, but to compassionate activity for the sake of all beings. In archetypal terms, it means becoming a hand of the great thousand-armed Avalokiteshvara. So, thank you for listening.